You may be wondering why a designer's up on stage in this august place. I'm certainly honored to be here. It's like Kevin, it's wonderful to be here. And I'm going to take a slightly different tack, perhaps, and propose some thoughts that come from my perspective as a designer, somebody who spends most of my time trying to figure out how to create things that people need. It's easy to think about this issue of resource, this issue of water, energy, and food being about stuff. Not enough resource in many parts of the world, too much consumption of resource in other parts of the world. And we can have long conversations about it, but in my view, it's largely about us. It's about people and how we behave. Our short-term focus on the satisfaction of our immediate needs versus long-term thinking about society's needs, for instance. And you might wonder, well, why is this a design problem? It's because design is the process of determining the relationship between people and stuff. That's what designers do. Whether it's designers like me or anybody that's doing anything where we're configuring the world in order to meet our needs. And so I want to propose a few thoughts about how we might change the way we think about the design of our world that might support perhaps a kind of a more sustainable approach. So I think ultimately what we have to focus on as we look to if we're going to look to innovate our way out of this problem is focusing on encouraging more sustainable behaviors. Back to that focus on people as much as the stuff. I'm going to give you an example of what I mean by designing behavior. We spend a lot of our time trying to regulate behavior, and this is an attempt to regulate behavior. For those of you who may have traveled on trains in Europe, you'll have seen this sign on the lavatory door. You'll also know from the smell of the lavatories how ineffective that sign actually is in its attempt to regulate the behavior of the male of the species. And some years ago, a very clever chap, actually at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, had a different idea about how to go about it. And his idea was this. Now, the guys in the audience will know exactly what this is. The ladies in the audience will probably not know. If you do, it'll be interesting. I'd love to know how you know. But this little device, this guy realized that if he printed it at exactly the right place in the urinal and gave guys something to aim at, they make much less mess. In fact, it turns out they make 80%. We make 80% less mess when we have something to aim at. Now, firstly, I would argue this was a significant contribution to quality of life, but it's also a really good example of designing a behavior, right? Instead of regulating a behavior. And so I want to go on and talk more about that tonight, but just so if you do nothing but remember that flies are important enablers of behavior. Here's another example, a little closer to home, that some of my colleagues here in London were involved recently working with Oxfam, looking to sort of change the behavior around a relatively simple thing that many of you, I'm sure, do, which is donate to Oxfam, donate your clothes. And it turns out by designing a very simple process of actually just filling in a little tag and dropping a bag off at the door, enables Oxfam to capture all of the gift aid tax that you will probably know more. I live in California, so I don't know exactly how all those laws work. But by designing a simple behavior, it has enabled Oxfam to raise, I believe, close to £3 million of extra revenue per year, about as much money as they spend on all their aid in Malawi, for instance, just by designing a very simple way for people to make their donations easier, and then therefore they do it more often. So I think that the behavior that we've got to focus on most when it comes to achieving something here is behaviors that are to do with collaboration. And I think it's about working together, sharing more, essentially creating more goodness with less resource that we're likely to eventually get somewhere. Paul Sappho, a futurist who lives out in my neighborhood in Palo Alto, talks about three kind of economic ages over the last 100 years or so. The 19th century was the industrial economy, the 20th century, the consumer economy, buy. And he talks about the 21st century as being the creator economy. It's not the creative economy, which would be great news for art school graduates like me, but the creator economy, which is, and the way he describes it, the example he gives is this one. We all know these guys. But what you may or may not have appreciated is that you're part of Google's workforce. that the way that their business model works is that they get to sell advertising or sell to advertisers based on the search strings that we all fill in, that we all provide to them. So if we weren't Google's workforce, they wouldn't have a product to sell to advertisers. And so this is what Paul Sappho means, is that a shift, if you like, from this idea of a very small number of producers and a large number of consumers to us all consuming and producing in different ways in the future. And so that notion of kind of collaboration and maybe even collaborative business models plays out in different ways. One term that you may or may not have come across is one called collaborative consumption. This idea that we're changing the way that we consume to whether, as I said before, many more consumers and producers. And there are several ways of thinking about this. Perhaps the simplest is this notion of the kind of shared economy, that we're making more efficient use of resources by sharing their use instead of, in this case, Whipcar is an organization that lets you rent out your own private car to other people. So instead of it sitting in the garage when you're not using it, it can be out on the roads being used by somebody else. Oh, and by the way, making money for you as well. And so it's just a very simple idea of more efficient use of resources, essentially, enabled by the internet. And there are many, many other businesses that we're seeing emerge today that are based on this sort of sharing economy. We're also seeing more and more examples of what we might call collaborative production, the sort of spreading out of consumption away from the sort of notion of centralized factories, for instance. The example that is perhaps most current is this kind of revolution that we're seeing in manufacturing based on 3D printing and other sorts of other digital technologies. This little guy, this MakerBot, you can buy now for about $2,000. About the cost of a laser printer a few years ago. Sit it on your your kind of desk at home and start making stuff. Start producing things. So it's not so difficult to imagine a time in the future where agricultural implements, for instance, might be manufactured by the local seed store in a village anywhere in the world, and we'll no longer have to deal with these long-distance supply chains in order to get the right product to the right person. Eventually, we're already seeing these technologies being used to manufacture implants in the medical industry. I mean, literally living organisms that are sprayed with our own stem cells. So it's not so very difficult to imagine these technologies starting to play a role in food production at some point in the future, for instance. So that's this idea of collaborative production. The next idea is how do we conserve more? How do we conserve better? And I think collaboration also plays a role here. O-Power is an organization that is a privately held sort of software as service company that partners with utility providers to promote energy efficiency. They ran a little test a while ago. They had some graduate students go and put these hangers on doors in neighborhoods in an attempt to see what would promote greater energy savings. You may be able to guess the answer, but it turns out that the first three hang tags, one which was based on saving money, another one which is based on saving the environment, a third one of just kind of being a better citizen, had no impact whatsoever. The fourth one had considerable impact. I think it was something like an 8 or 10% shift in conservation based on people knowing that their neighbors were doing it. So it's sort of competitive collaboration, you might describe that as. Another example where I think kind of collaboration has played out in an interesting way. CoolBiz is a movement that got started in Japan a few years ago by the then Prime Minister, based on the idea of Japan trying to meet its then commitments to the Kyoto Protocol, where they were trying to get a significant reduction in carbon output. And CoolBiz was an attempt to take Japanese businessmen and persuade them that in the summertime, if they wore more casual clothing, that the air conditioning units on office buildings, the temperature could be turned up and we could save energy. And it was a considerable challenge to persuade Japanese businessmen not to wear their neckties to work in the summertime. And so it consisted of this whole campaign, including a fashion show where the Prime Minister and the CEO of every major corporation in Japan modeled this new range of casual summer business clothing. And these little pins that people wore when they went to their companies wearing this casual clothing, if you were wearing this pin and your company had signed up to the program, then your boss was not allowed to criticize you for wearing these clothes. There's also a version of it called Warm Biz for the winter time, which I think includes woolly hats and nice sweaters like this that I'm wearing. I'm supporting Warm Biz tonight. Again, this was based on communities collaborating to conserve. And this sort of kind of final idea about collaboration is that we can use collaboration to actually tackle some of the innovation that we might be trying to create around these challenges. We've been running our own little experiment. We've built a community of about 20,000 people now around the world that are working together on things like food and water innovation challenges in countries like Australia, in Africa, in the States, and in Europe. We're finding people from almost all over the world that are interested in participating in looking for solutions to some of these problems. Similarly, there's a platform that we created along with the Gates Foundation, which is pushing out the tools, the innovation tools, out to the NGO community around the world who are trying to solve these problems on the ground. So we can use the sort of networks of creative collaboration, perhaps, to spread and scale solutions in the future. So kind of finally, I want to kind of end up by just talking about what some of the principles might be that we might use to support this notion of designing behavior and designing behavior change. The first is that, if you start with the stuff, it's really hard to make sense to people. So starting with humans is a pretty important design principle when it comes to designing behavior. And that if you're going to do that, it's often interesting to go and look for the extremes. I love the William Gibson quote, which is, "The future's already here, it's just not well distributed yet." And that's true of people as much as it is of technology, that you can find people doing really interesting and really creative things out at the extremes. So go look for them, go find those people. It also turns out that if we're going to change our behavior, that we can't, as I mentioned earlier, we can't just regulate our way to it. We need to give people a mix of rules, a mix of tools, things that help them. And then also, we need to recognize that our social norms in many cases need to change, that our political behaviors need to change, our social behaviors need to change. And we can see how effective that's been in things like smoking regulation, for instance, that it's as much social norms that have enforced that behavior change as it is regulation. We need to get beyond the idea that solving these challenges are about selecting from a set of existing choices. We need to be putting new choices on the table. So we need to be as good at divergent thinking as we are at convergent thinking. And we need to recognize that it's complex, that we have to balance the needs of people with what technology can actually achieve and with what's viable in the long term. So finally, I'd like to leave you with a kind of a sort of a metaphor for how I think we need to think about this, based on two rather well-known British scientists. I think our existing ideas about how we design for these sorts of complex situations are based on this guy, Sir Isaac Newton. That we have a sort of a Newtonian view of how to solve these problems based on a sort of top-down approach that where we believe we can imagine the whole system, imagine every state that it's going to be in, and predict the future. But it turns out we can't. We know we can't. And it's not working as an approach. And the sort of evidence or the sort of the way that appears as an outcome of design is this, the blueprint. That we're trying to create blueprints for the future. And I don't think blueprints help us, because blueprints are just kind of one version of the future. And they assume we know everything. Instead, I think we might need to think a little bit more about this guy, somebody who, if not stood on this stage, was certainly involved in this organization, Charles Darwin. And base our thinking on ones of evolution, of constant change, of bottom-up, of the notion that it's never finished, and perhaps that it's also somewhat unpredictable at the large scale, and that the outcome that we should be thinking about is less the notion of a blueprint and more the notion of code. And that, in fact, what we want to be doing is recoding our behavior as human beings in order to attempt, ultimately, I think, to create sort of a sustainable future for ourselves. So thank you very much.